Okay. So I want to pick off where we left off on Monday here and continue on with the respiratory zone here. Okay. So when we're in the respiratory zone, now we're going to be talking about where gas exchange is going to occur. So we're going to be literally dealing with the terminal part of our bronchial tree, which involves the last of the tubing portion, which is the respiratory bronchioles, and then the alveolar duct, which is that little kind of entranceway into the sac at the end. Let me show you a good picture here. This one I really do kind of like. I'm going to zoom in here because the other models we have are not to my liking. All right, so air is going to be traveling down into the bronchiole here, okay? And as it's traveling down, it's going to go into our respiratory bronchioles. And at the very end, it'll come out into one of these little structures here, and those are called the alveolar ducts. And at the ends of these ducts are where we have the alveoli. Okay? So think of it like this. Alveoli are like the grape, and the alveolar duct is like the stem that leads to the individual grape. Okay? And then several grapes will then connect to, all right, the respiratory bronchiole, okay, which will then connect to a larger airway passage and so forth and so on as we're moving away from the alveoli. I just like this because the other model is not that great, doesn't really show you this. So you have your respiratory bronchiole, and then this slight short passageway here, that's the alveolar duct. Remember with glands, we had the secretory portion, okay, and then we had the ducts, which was the conducting portion. Well, that's kind of what we're having here. The alveoli, all right, is going to be like the acini portion of the gland, and then you have the duct, which will conduct, all right, the secretions to the gland. But in this case, we're conducting the respiratory gases, okay? So at the end of the alveolar duct is where our alveoli are going to be located. All right, so what the heck are the alveoli, okay? This is the site for gas exchange. Okay, these little ball-like structures or sac-like structures, all right, will have capillary beds all throughout. Okay, when I say all throughout, surrounding them. Okay, each lung is going to have about 300 to 400 million. That's a lot. That's a lot of sites for gas exchange. Okay, so you can see this is an electron microscope here. So that's a very high-powered microscope. So here's that respiratory bronchiole. All right, and then at the very end here, you can't really see it. All right, but you have, again, it's hard to see in the respiratory, on the electron microscope. You have this little passageway here, and that's the alveolar duct. And then at the end of the passageway, all right, you'll see these small, it almost looks like a honeycomb type of thing, but these small little nooks and crannies, okay, those little nooks and crannies are going to be the alveoli. Now, there's a really kind of cool aspect to the alveoli, okay? And when air is coming into the alveoli, think of it like filling up a balloon. You're going to inflate a balloon, you're blowing into the balloon, all right? But if you notice, you keep blowing into the balloon's going to inflate and get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, all right? So the alveoli have these pores here, these openings, and it allows air to pass through the alveoli. Okay, so you're not going to be putting too much of a stretch on it, but it also creates this collateral ventilation system, right, that allows the air to travel to several different adjacent alveoli, and it helps to increase or maximize the exchange of the respiratory gases there. Okay. In addition, you'll see, and I'll show you on another model here, all right, our blood vessels, we refer to those as the pulmonary capillaries. And in between, all right, these little alveoli is a wall. And that's the interalveolar septum. And it's loaded with elastic fibers. And it's these elastic fibers which are going to allow, when you're exhaling, the alveoli to spring back into their original configuration here. So there's a couple different types of cells that we're going to see in the alveoli. The predominant cell type are the type 1. And those are going to be the squamous shaped cells. Okay? And so this is where this is the site for gas exchange. So we refer to these cells also as the alveolar epithelium. Okay, so as you know, epithelial cells always sit on a basement membrane. So these cells will sit on this basement membrane and they'll help to make up that alveolar wall. Now throughout, all right, these alveoli, you'll have these other cells, the type 2, the septal cells. These are the ones that make surfactant. And it's surfactant that as you're exhaling, all right, as the alveoli kind of spring back to their original shape, this surfactant prevents the alveoli from collapsing. You don't start producing the surfactant until week, I want to say it's 24 or week 26. That's why with premature children, all right, they want to make sure that they can get them to grow inside of mom, or develop, I should say, inside of mom, all right, up until about week 26, all right, because by that time, these cells have started to produce surfactant. If they don't produce surfactant, all right, then the alveoli will collapse on them. They'll collapse on each other, okay? And you can't have respiration with collapsed alveoli. So in that case, where they're not producing surfactant, we just give them steroids. And that will stimulate these cells to produce surfactant. And then the third type of cell are our immune cells, all right, the macrophages, okay? And they'll kind of roll through the alveoli region there, because guess what? When you're breathing air in, if you live in the city versus living in the mountains, all right, the air quality is going to be different. You're going to be breathing in most likely more pollutants, and it's these cells here, all right, that are going to help take care of those pollutants, those microorganisms that might gain entry into your respiratory system. All right, so the respiratory membrane, all right, is made up of three things, okay? The alveolar epithelium, all right, which is going to be the simple squamous epithelium, all right, and the capillary epithelium, which again is going to be simple squamous epithelium, all right? And then remember, all right, epithelial tissue sits on a basement membrane. But here's the thing, both of these basement membranes are fused together. Okay, so they sit back to back. Okay, so here's the basement membrane. Here is your alveolar epithelial simple squamous cell on one side of it, and then on the other side is your capillary simple squamous epithelial cell. All right, so they share the same basement membrane. Okay, and so this allows, well, I'll show you the picture here. Okay, this is pretty much the thinnest type of barrier that you could possibly have in your body. Okay, literally, all right, 2 cell layers thick, all right, with a fused basement membrane. Okay, remember, the thinner the better when we're dealing with filtration, all right, secretion, absorption. Okay, that's what we want. So as you know, all right, oxygen is going to diffuse across this barrier, all right, from the air into the blood, and carbon dioxide will diffuse from the blood into the alveoli and out as you exhale. Okay, so this picture here shows us, okay, this relationship. Here you can see, all right, here's the capillary epithelium, all right, and then you have your respiratory or alveolar epithelium, and right in between this kind of dark, I don't know, brownish line, that's your basement membrane. Again, this allows for the nice diffusion across, all right, for these respiratory gases. Carbon dioxide and oxygen are so small, right, they don't need a transporter to get across the cell membranes. They can diffuse across freely, easily, okay? So you can kind of see here's our alveoli, all right, and then we have a couple of our, you have your alveolar cells here, all right, your type 1s, okay? And then throughout here, you can see we have our type 2, and these guys are producing the surfactant. And then every once in a while, we'll have one of our macrophages, all right, just kind of floating around. And you see here is a pore of Kohn or an alveolar pore. Here's another one. And it just, again, as you're breathing in, it allows air to flow in and across and wherever, okay? All right, so if you have your atlas handy, we can look at one of our models here. All right, so 24 is representing this hole where this kind of, I don't know, grayish line or circle here is representing. This whole space is an alveolus. All right, and it's surrounded by that capillary bed. So you can see we've kind of cut through the alveoli here, and you can see here's some of the capillaries. Anything that's red throughout this area is a capillary. All right, anything brown on this model, all right, is going to be a type 2 or a septal cell. These are going to be the cells that are going to, again, produce the surfactant. And then you can see here is one of our pores of Kahn, or an alveoli pore. When I say Kahn, what do you think of? Okay. I think of the Wrath of Khan, Star Trek. All right, that's fine. I see where your minds are going. No one's on board with me. Okay, which was the best Star Trek movie, by the way. Khan! I forgot his name. The guy that used to be on Fantasy Island, the original one. Oh, what's his name? Anyways, he played Khan. Okay, so now we're going to just flip this model over. All right, this is it from the inside. Okay, so now we're going to look at it from the outside. All right. So again, you can see all these red, all right, interlocking lines here. Those are the pulmonary capillaries. All right. And here's another pore of Kahn, or alveolar pore. And these black lines represent the elastic fibers. Okay. So the elastic fibers are going to allow, all right, these alveoli to return to their original shape during the passive process of expiration. Okay. So all this, you can see it's quite extensive for the capillary bed, and quite a few are elastic fibers just crisscrossing everywhere. All right, now we're going to go and talk about some gross anatomy. Actually talk about the lungs themselves, like if you were to hold them in your hands. Okay. All right, so first of all, the lungs are located laterally to the mediastinum. Do y'all remember what the mediastinum is? Okay, it's a cavity. It's a central cavity just posterior to your sternum, your breastbone there. Okay, so it's in the middle of you, in the center portion of your thorax. So your lungs sit on either side of that. Okay, and so we'll talk about what the bronchial tree is, but it's basically, well, I thought I showed you. All right, there's the bronchial tree. Okay, look how colorful that is. It looks beautiful. All right, basically the bronchial tree is just showing you after the trachea bifurcates, the primary, secondary, tertiary, all right, when we start to get down into our respiratory bronchioles. All right, it's just showing you, all right, that gradual decreasing in the size and the shape of the lumens. All right, so that's our bronchial tree. So that's what we're going to see, all right, in our lungs, all right, and it's going to include, remember, there's two parts to our respiratory system, the actual site for gas exchange, or the part that has gas exchange, and that's the respiratory portion, all right, and then there's the conducting portion, okay? So it's going to have all of the respiratory portion, all right? It will have part of the conducting portion, because part of the conducting portion is also the nose, the nasal cavity, the oral cavity, the pharynx, the trachea. Okay? So our lungs have a cone-like shape, which means they're pointy at the top and wide at the bottom. Okay? So the apex is also known as the cupula. You should know that term. Okay? That's going to be right behind the clavicle. And technically, if your doctor does a thorough job when they're going to listen to your lungs, they should be placing their stethoscope over the apex of the lung. That will be on the just above the clavicle there. You can palpate the apex of the lung there. The base of it, of the lung, the fatter portion is at the bottom, and that sits right on top of the diaphragm there. Okay? So your lungs have a couple different surfaces, and we name those surfaces with where the lungs come in contact with. Okay, so obviously the part of the lung that's against the ribs is the costal surface. The part of the lungs that are going to be immediately on either side of the mediastinal is called the mediastinum, excuse me, are the mediastinal surface, and then where your lungs make contact, all right, with the diaphragm, we call that the diaphragmatic surface. Now this term should be very familiar with you. Hilum, all right? The hilum, like we saw that with the spleen, we saw that with a lymph node, all right? That's like an indentation into whatever structure that we're talking about, that a lot of stuff is going in and some stuff is coming out. All right, anatomically, when we're looking at it from a gross anatomy aspect, we also refer to that as the root when it includes all of the structures going in and out. So what are some of the structures? Well, the bronchi, right? The windpipe, I shouldn't say the windpipe, because you'll confuse it with the trachea. All right, the conducting pipes that go into the lungs there. All right, our blood vessels that are going to be twofold. Okay, you're going to have blood vessels that go in that are just going to undergo exchange of gases, all right, so they can go back to the heart and get pumped out to the rest of the body. And then you also have blood vessels that are going to be entering into the lungs to supply the tissues that actually make the lungs, all right? Then, of course, we have to have part of the control center there, the autonomic nerves, and then, of course, lymph vessels. We need to have those. We need to drain stuff out of there, okay? So here you can see a nice picture, all right, of the mediastinum right here in the center, represented by that light blue structure. All right, diaphragmatic surface is that bottom portion where the lungs sit on the diaphragm. And then you can see nicely here the costal surface, any area here, all right, where the lungs, all right, are adjacent to the ribs. So if you look here, here's the clavicle, and just posterior to the clavicle, and it's encirculated by the first rib here. There's the apex of the lung. Okay, so it kind of pops up there. So really, the physician, if they really want to do a good job, they should listen to the apex. I do when I do my CDL exams. Okay, just check it out. Okay, and there's actually a tumor that will sit up there. It's called a Pancoast tumor. It can cause issues with the breathing. All right, so let's talk about each lung. Okay, the right is the bigger one, and that's because the heart is on the left side, and so the left lung has to accommodate for the heart, so it's going to be the smaller one. Okay, so the right has 3 lobes, the left has 2. Okay, and if it has 3 lobes, that means it has 2 fissures, because the fissures are these little indentations and spaces that divide one lobe from the next. So on our right lung, you can see you have one fissure that's more horizontal. So guess what we call that one? We're not very original when it comes to this. We call it the horizontal fissure. And then we have one that is kind of vertical and horizontal. It's at a slant. That's the oblique. So the horizontal fissure is going to divide the superior lobe from the middle lobe, whereas the oblique fissure is going to divide the middle lobe from the inferior lobe. Okay, and then on our left lung here, you only have one fissure. Okay, that's going to divide the superior lobe from the inferior lobe. That's the oblique fissure, and that's going to be on the left side. Okay. All right. Now, the left lung has a special little projection called the lingula. All right, it's believed, all right, that it's the left lung's version of the middle lobe. It's a tiny little thing. Okay, lingula, all right, means tongue-like, so it kind of looks like a small little tongue that's hanging off of the superior lobe there. Okay, so on the left lung, pardon?
Very obvious.
So on the left lung, you have a couple impressions or indentations, mainly from the heart. Okay, the cardiac impression is going to be on the medial surface of the lung, and that's from the heart. The cardiac notch, all right, that is going to be from the aorta. All right, so I'll show you a quick picture here. Let me zoom in a little bit. All right, so here you see the right lung. You can see the root of the lung with all the blood vessels and the lymphatic. Well, you can't really see the lymphatic vessels here, but the bronchi. You don't even see any nerves here. But this region here is going to be the root. okay? When we move up here to the left, you can see, all right, this impression here, that's the cardiac impression. This little divot here, this little notch here, that's the cardiac notch. And you have this flattened surface here, that's the diaphragmatic surface there of both lungs. Okay, so keep in mind, the right lung has 3 lobes, the left lung has 2 lobes. So each lung, now we're going to further subdivide, all right, into segments, okay? So when we're talking about the right lung, you will have 10 segments, okay, throughout all the 10 segments total, okay, I should say. I'm not going to expect you to memorize these. The left lung, it varies. You can have 8 to 10 segments in the left lung, all right? But here's the important thing, all right? Each of these segments has its own segmental bronchus supplying it and its own pulmonary artery, vein, and lymphatic vessel, okay? But what I love about this is if one of those segments becomes sickly or damaged, cancerous, let's even say, all right, or fibrosed, you can take that segment out without affecting the functionality of the other segments in the same lobe or adjacent lobes. It's pretty cool, okay? It's really neat how this is all kind of wired up, okay? So then by that concept, these are autonomous, which means they can operate on their own. So they can operate on their own, each of these segments, then if you take one segment out, it will not impact on the functionality of the other segments, okay? Now, we're going to go even smaller. So within each segment, all right, we have smaller portions of those lung segments that we break down into what we call lobules. And then each lobule has its own terminal bronchi, arterial, venule, and lymphatic vessel. So you see what I'm saying? This concept is important because, especially if you have to remove, and if you ever met somebody that's ever had part of their lung removed, all right, it's unfortunate that you have to have part of the lung removed. God forbid you have to have a lobe removed. One of my colleagues, his mother had I think it was 2 lobes removed from her left or right lung, and she's still doing, you know, pretty well. I mean, she's almost 90. She still drives around. I mean, but she's not going to be running marathons, all right? But the fact of the matter is that it hasn't compromised her respiratory function, all right, in the other lobes. I just find it to be fascinating. Okay, so again, this is just a picture here of, all right, all the different, you can see here, for example, on the right side, all right, we have, all right, 3 segments here in the superior lobe, all right, 2 in the middle lobe, and then we have 4 in the inferior lobe. Again, within these lobes now, you can kind of see you have the smaller lobules. So each of the actual overall lobe has its own blood supply, bronchi going there. And then those bronchi will then supply each individual segment. And then each individual lobule within those segments has its own, again, blood supply, bronchial, and lymphatic drainage. This is really cool. So that's that. All right. Let's label this guy here. Okay, this is an anterior view of the lungs. So we're looking at the screen, all right, our right is the lungs left. And you need to be specific on this too, okay? You need to be able to tell which is which, all right? Which is easy. Look at the heart. Whatever side the heart's on, that's the left side, okay? So that's what you should be thinking right away. Okay, here's the left side. This is the left lung, this is the right lung. Yeah, all right, we're going to get there. So now you can see with these little curved lines here, those are representing the apex or the apices of the lungs, and then these black kind of slightly curved solid lines are representing the base of each lung, okay? All right, so our right lung has 3 lobes, okay? So we're looking at the right superior lobe, and you need to make sure that you're discerning which is the right and which is the left, okay? So this is the right superior lobe, all right? This is the right middle lobe, and then this is the right inferior lobe. Now, granted, all right, the left doesn't have a middle lobe, all right? But better to be safe than sorry. Just put right, okay? Middle lobe, okay? Over here is the left superior lobe, and then the left inferior lobe, okay? This dotted line is representing one of the fissures. It's pretty much horizontal, so therefore it's going to be, all right, the right horizontal fissure. This one's kind of going more at an angle. That's the right oblique fissure. And then you have the one fissure over here, all right, and that is going to be the left oblique fissure. And then we also have, not to forget, our cardiac notch here, where the heart is pressing against the left lung. Did I miss anything? I don't think so. Okay. You can't see it here. Oh, that's I know, it's a common thing. I can't remember if it's 210. There was one class in which, oh no, it might be, because if you've taken 210, you've already labeled some of the things when we get to the digestive. Wait till we add some more stuff to some of those things that you labeled in 210. All right, it's not a lot, so you're gonna be, I think digestive, you're gonna be like, oh, all right, I already have most of this labeled, so you won't have to be freaking out. Okay, let's quickly talk about blood supply, and then we're almost done. Oh, I found someone, I couldn't believe someone left that in one of my classes last semester. Or I found it in the classroom. Okay, so blood supply to the lungs. There's two types. All right, we've already talked about pulmonary circulation. Remember when we were doing the circulatory system, we talked about systemic circulation, and that's the blood that leaves the left ventricle, that it gets pumped out to all the tissues of the body. Well, the pulmonary circulation is the blood that gets pumped out of the right ventricle, which carries deoxygenated blood, okay? And it's going to travel to the lungs to get oxygenated, okay? Or what we refer to as, we're going to replenish our O2 and get rid of our carbon dioxide, okay? So keep in mind, the pulmonary arteries carry deoxygenated blood. So if you see something that's blue, a vascular structure on the test, and it's in the lungs, okay, it's deoxygenated blood, yes, but it's most likely going to be an artery, okay? Be able to differentiate that, okay? So then the pulmonary arteries will then get smaller and turn into pulmonary arterioles, which will eventually then turn into the pulmonary capillaries. That's where the site of gas exchange occurs. And then on the other side of the pulmonary capillaries, we'll have the pulmonary venules, and then the pulmonary venules will get bigger and turn into the pulmonary veins. And so the oxygenated blood returns back to the heart in the pulmonary veins. Okay? And it goes to the heart, into the left atrium, which then moves into the left ventricle, and then out to the systemic circulation. That's pulmonary circulation. All right, bronchial circulation. This circulation goes to supply the tissues of the lungs, and it will be oxygenated. It doesn't make sense to try to supply the tissues of the lungs with deoxygenated blood. Okay? All right, so easy. Okay, because we briefly talked about this, but we're just going to quickly review it. The bronchial arteries, and it varies between 3 to 4, come off of the descending thoracic aorta. All right, and they're going to travel, all right, into the root or the hilum of the lungs and supply, okay, those lungs. And then the deoxygenated blood that is going to be leaving the lungs, all right, are the bronchial veins. Okay, and those veins will drain into the esophagus and the hemiesophagus. Don't worry about that. Okay. But the bronchial veins are going to drain the lungs of venous blood or deoxygenate it. So here, this picture here does a great job, okay, kind of showing us, all right, the pulmonary circulation. Okay, right atrium, right ventricle. The right ventricle pumps the deoxygenated blood, okay, out into the pulmonary arteries. The right and left pulmonary arteries go to the right and left lungs respectively. Okay, they will travel throughout to the different lobes, into the different segments, into the different lobules, and so forth. Eventually, okay, it will start to scale down here, all right, into the pulmonary arteriole. And these pulmonary arterioles will then branch out into the pulmonary capillaries. That's when we'll get the exchange of blood. On the other side of the pulmonary capillary bed is going to be the venule, which will receive oxygenated blood. Okay, that oxygenated blood will then travel through the pulmonary venule, all right, and then travel up to the pulmonary vein and eventually drain into the left atrium of the heart. Okay. Here you can see that nice exchange there. All right, almost done. I know you're sad, as am I. Remember the pleura? Remember way back in chapter, well, actually the first lab chapter, we talked about the serous membranes, right? And serous membranes are the membranes that cover cavities within the body. Well, the cavity that the lungs, all right, live in is going to be in the thoracic cavity, all right? But the cavity is called the pleural cavity. And so the pleural cavity is going to have this lining there that is made up of simple squamous epithelium that's going to sit on some loose connective tissue. Well, that's good because loose connective tissue is highly vascularized, a lot of space. We can have the predominant thing in loose connective tissue are cells. So we can have migration of different types of cells, predominantly immune cells. So as you remember, all right, the pleural membrane, all right, which is a serous membrane, has two layers. So the layer that directly covers the organ, all right, in this case the lung, is going to be the visceral pleura. It lays right on top of the lung. All right. And the other layer is going to be the parietal layer, and that's going to line the cavity. So what is the cavity? The inside of the thoracic walls. All right, remember, here's the mediastinum. On either side of the mediastinum sit the lungs. So the lateral portion here of the mediastinum is lined by the parietal pleura. And then obviously the bottom portion, where the diaphragm is, all right, that's going to be lined by the parietal pleura. Okay? So if you recall, there's actually a space in between the two layers, all right? Primarily, it's a potential space. We call it that, okay? Well, I'll tell you that in a second here. Oh, important aspect I should have mentioned this, okay? So each of these visceral pleural membranes, all right, surround each lung individually, which is good. They're not connected because that can help to inhibit the spread of certain types of infections. So the pleural cavity, okay, is this space in between the serous layer and the visceral layer, okay? And it's usually filled with fluid. Not totally filled, but there's fluid in there. And its job is to provide lubrication. So when you're breathing in and out and exhaling, inhaling, exhaling, all right, when the lungs expand and contract, all right, that's going to create friction, okay? Well, that serous fluid reduces the friction, all right? But when you inflate your lungs, all right, you have what we refer to as a potential space in that area there. And that's when these two layers will pretty much be touching each other. And that's why, if there's anyone here, has anyone here heard of a pneumothorax? It's a collapsed lung. And what will happen is we've now penetrated into this potential space, and air is flooded into that space and literally collapsed the lung. All right. All right, last slide. Muscles for breathing, okay? Predominantly, breathing, we'll talk more about this in lecture, but breathing, the only active part of breathing is taking a breath in. When you exhale, all right, you are relaxing everything. So that's not really the active portion. So as we're all sitting here right now, these pretty much should be the only muscles that you're utilizing. You might not be able to see that. All right, so the diaphragm, which is the heavy breathing muscle, that's the main lifter, that's right here. okay, and your external intercostals. Those are the muscle fibers, all right, that will point down and in, like putting your hands into your front pocket. Because when you breathe, your ribs lift up like a bucket handle. They go up and out. So how I tell folks to remember, right, what muscles help with that when you have to do a forced inspiration. If you ever go to the doctor, like, take a deep breath in, hold it, because when you do that, you're expanding and making your thoracic cavity larger. So if we look here, all right, and we're taking a big, deep breath in, any muscle, all right, that's going to help to lift the ribs up and out. You can see the scalenes, they attach onto the first and second ribs, all right? All right, your sternocleidoid mastoid muscle attaches onto the manubrium here, but also it'll attach onto the clavicle. That helps to also elevate, all right, the upper portion of your thorax. Now, people that have, I'm going to hold that thought for a second. I'll share that with you in lecture. All right, when we go over here, all right, well, we'll stay on the front. We didn't have to learn this muscle here, but pec minor here attaches onto ribs 3 through 6, or excuse me, ribs 2 through 6. All right, that helps to elevate the upper ribs here. All right, but when we get over to the back side, you can see we didn't have to know this muscle either. Remember, we had to know this muscle, but this is the serratus posterior superior. It helps to elevate the upper 4 ribs during a deep breath, and as do all these erector spinae muscles, especially in the thoracic region, all right, as you're taking that deep breath in, all right, because of their attachment sites onto these ribs will help to elevate. So any muscle that helps to pull the ribs up and out is going to help with forced inspiration, all right? So just the opposite when we're talking about forced expiration, forcing out a breath, all right, any muscles that are going to help pull the ribs down, okay? So you might not remember this muscle here, transversus thoracis, but that's on the inside of the thorax here, all right? And that helps, that attaches 1 rib to 2 ribs above it, all right? And it helps to pull those ribs down in this place here. Serratus posterior inferior, you can see how it attaches onto the lower portion of the thoracic spine and onto the lower false ribs here, all right, ribs not 10 through 12, all right, it helps to pull those back down and in. And then our internal intercostals will help to pull them down. And then our last two that we really don't see too often, the transversus abdominis muscle here and our external oblique, all right, those will also help to pull those ribs down. The transversus abdominis will help to decrease the intra-abdominal pressure, which will help to decrease the pressure in there too. Ah, that was it. Woo! I know it's not terribly exciting and sexy, but it's also informative. Okay, so that's it for the respiratory system. Okay, which means I have on Monday. Okay, we're probably not going to do any lab. We're still going to have lab class. Because I got to catch up on the respiratory system. So it's going to be a lot of respiratory lecture material that we're going to cover. Okay. Hopefully you'll find the respiratory system as exciting as I do. If not, I apologize. Otherwise, have a wonderful week.